Chapter 1. London, November 1901. The room was full of ghosts, or so Felicity Johnson would have had him believe. Sir Maurice Newberry, weary from a day spent scouring the dusty stacks of the British Library, drummed his fingers on the table with a quiet impatience. The dinner party was not working out at all as he'd anticipated. Around him, the other guests sat in a wide circle, spaced evenly around a large, round table, their faces glowing in the dim light of the gas lamps. Overturned tumblers, tarot cards, holly leaves, and other assorted paraphernalia littered the tabletop, and their host, her shrill voice piercing the otherwise silent room, was attempting to raise the dead. Newberry, decidedly unimpressed by the charade, glanced at the other guests around the table. Their faces were difficult to read in the half-light, but many of them appeared captivated by the performance of the woman as she waved her arms about her, wailing, her eyes tight, her body tensed, possessed, apparently, by some kind of unearthly spirit. She was currently engaged in babbling something about Meredith York's dead brother, and the poor woman was entirely taken in, sobbing on her husband's arm as if she truly believed she were receiving messages from beyond the grave. Newberry shot a look at the man seated beside him and shrugged. Sir Charles Bainbridge was a chief inspector at the New Scotland Yard, a favoured agent of Queen Victoria herself, and one of the most rational men in Newberry's acquaintance. He didn't think for a minute that his old friend would be taken in by any of this nonsense. He was older than Newberry, about 10 years his senior, and was graying slightly around the temples. His moustache was bushy and full, and his eyes were bright, shining with mischief and the glassy patina of alcohol. Acknowledging the pained expression on his friend's face, Bainbridge offered an amused smile, the flickering light casting his face in stark relief. Clearly he was considerably more forgiving of the indulgences of their host. Newberry reached for his brandy in exasperation. A few moments later Miss Johnson fell back in her chair with a gasp, her eyes suddenly flicking open, her hands raised to her mouth in feigned shock. She turned to survey her guests. "Did I?" Meredith York nodded empathetically, and, a moment later, when the gas lamps were turned up and the room was once again cast in a warm orange glow, the small audience paid tribute to their host with a hearty round of applause. Newberry sat back in his chair, relieved that the spectacle was over. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling a sense of lethargy creeping over him. The other guests were already deep in conversation as he surveyed the scene with the air of someone ready to take their leave. He didn't want to be drawn in his opinions of the evening's pursuit, lest he inadvertently cause offense. He patted his friend's arm. "Charles?" The other man turned to regard him, and Newberry stifled a yawn. "My lodgings beckon me. I'm intent on taking a stroll. Would you care to join me?" Bainbridge allowed himself a brief chuckle at the other man's expense. "That keen to get away, Newberry?" He shook his head in feigned disapproval, but his smile was barely concealed. "I had a feeling that you'd find all of this rather objectionable. Come on, let's bid our friends good night and take our leave." The two men stood together, and Felicity Johnson almost leapt out of her seat when she spotted them out of the corner of her eye. She briefly patted Meredith York on the back of the hand before turning to regard them. "Oh, gentlemen, must you go so soon?" Newberry edged around the table and took her hand. "I am afraid that duty calls, my dear Miss Johnson. Both Charles and I have early appointments to keep in the morning. Thank you for a pleasant evening." He paused, unsure how to go on. "It has been an entertaining diversion." He inclined his head politely and turned to reclaim his coat from the butler standing by the door. The woman's face fell, and she stammered briefly before replying, "Always a pleasure, Sir Maurice." She turned to Bainbridge, who was just collecting his cane from the hat stand in the hallway. "And you, Sir Charles, I do hope we will see you both again soon." And with that she returned her attention to the adoration of Meredith York and her other guests. Outside, the pavement was covered in a layer of hoary frost. Newberry turned his collar up against the biting winter chill. The moon was full in the sky, the night was clear, and people bustled along the street, their breaths making foggy clouds in the cold air. Newberry drew the crisp air deep into his lungs, obviously relieved to have escaped further embarrassment at the hands of Miss Johnson. Bainbridge, his cane clicking rhythmically against the ground as he walked, turned to Newberry as they made their way back towards Piccadilly. "Really, Newberry? Did you have to cut her so?" "Oh, Charles, the woman's a buffoon! She's trifling with things she has no real concept of, making light of Miss York's bereavement. Games like that are dangerous and hurtful." He shook his head, sighing. I did not aim to cause offense. I simply wanted to let her know that we were not taken in by her little merriment. You know as well as I do there were no spirits present in that room. They stopped as a ground train trundled by, the huge steam engine roaring as the firemen stoked the flames, the carriages behind it bouncing along the cobbled road, their wooden wheels creaking under the strain. Newberry caught stuttering glimpses of the people inside the small carriages as they rushed by, snug inside their little booths, speeding on towards their destinations. The driver, on the other hand, was wrapped up warm against the elements, sitting atop the engine itself on a large dickey box, a huge steering wheel clasped between his gloved hands. They watched as it rattled away into the night, causing hansom cabs and more traditional horse-drawn carriages to divert from their paths. It was time for the past to make way for the present. The two men crossed the road and continued on their way. Newberry decided it was time to change the subject. So tell me, Charles, any new developments in the case at hand? The other man sighed. Not as such. Can't seem to get past this ridiculous story about the glowing policemen. It's making life very difficult for my constables. They keep being accosted out on their rounds. No one will answer their questions, and the men themselves don't want to go out at night lest they find themselves running into this damnable fellow. Superstitious pigs. Newberry looked suddenly curious. Charles, he patted the other man on the shoulder. Look who has his ire up now. Don't be so swift to discount these stories, at least before we have any real evidence to the contrary. Bainbridge looked incredulous. Heavens, Newberry, surely you're not putting any stock in these ridiculous tales. They're clearly as much poppycock as Miss Johnson's spirits. Newberry hesitated. Look, Charles, I know I was dismissive of Miss Johnson, but I've spent the entire day scouring shelves in the British Library looking for references to a glowing policeman, and I assure you there is more to it than meets the eye. Bainbridge stopped in his tracks. He leaned on his cane. How so? There's a case from about 12 years ago. A bobby who was murdered by a gang of petty thieves found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know the sort of thing. Bainbridge nodded. Well, for a month after the body was interred, a glowing bobby was seen looming out in the fog around the Whitechapel area, his pale skin shining an iridescent blue. One by one the bodies of the thieves turned up, all strangled, all dumped in the same area of the city. Witnesses report sightings of the dead constable, come back from the grave to seek revenge on his aggressors. After the last of the thieves turned up dead, the glowing bobby was never seen again. He paused. Until now, that is. I pieced the story together from various newspaper articles. Bainbridge shrugged. It was probably the other boys from the station using the story as a cover to take revenge for the murder. They don't take kindly to one of their own being put in the soil. It was Newberry's turn to nod. That may well be the case, but until we know no more, I think we need to follow this line of inquiry. It may turn out to be nothing but poppycock, but we shouldn't dismiss it until we've had the opportunity to investigate a little further first. Very well. Bainbridge covered his mouth with the back of his hand as he coughed. Come on, let's get out of this cold. Newberry sauntered along beside him. Would you care to join me for a nightcap at the White Friars? They have a shockingly good brandy. Bainbridge was about to reply when a sudden, powerful gust of wind knocked them both back a step, and the other man found himself clinging to his hat to ensure it wasn't lost in the drop. He looked up. Damn airships! I wish they wouldn't fly them so low over the city. Newberry laughed, following his gaze. The underbelly of an immense vessel was scudding overhead, scintillating in the reflected light of the city and temporarily blotting out the moon, casting the two men in dark shadow. The airship companies had been enjoying a period of rapid growth in recent months, with demand for air travel almost exceeding their capacity to build new vessels and clear space for berthing fields. The appearance of a sizable ship such as this was becoming a frequent occurrence in the skies over London, as the empire grew larger and an increasing number of people found profitable business abroad. With the haulage companies taking to the skies too, there was no longer any need to relocate to foreign climes on a permanent basis, and many businessmen had taken the opportunity to set up subsidiary companies in India, America, and the West Indies. Newberry himself had never traveled on one of the vessels, but he was certainly enamored with them, and watched in wonder as this one drifted lazily overhead, en route, he supposed, to a berthing field south of the city. He glanced back at Bainbridge, who had finally finished repositioning his hat. Well, to the White Friars? Bainbridge shook his head. Not tonight, old friend. You've given me much to think about, and I must say that pudding of Miss Johnson's is sitting rather heavily on me now. Don't have quite the constitution I used to." Newberry smiled. "You'll hear no argument from me." He held out his hand, and the other man grasped it firmly. "Let me know if there are any further developments in the case. In the meantime, I bid you well and good night." He turned and made off in the direction of the White Friars Club, gazing up at the sky in wonder at the vapor trails left in the wake of the passing airship.